Um, all right, so yeah, I want to talk about the history of 2865. This is one history from one particular perspective. I started graduate school here at Davis in 2011, which was, when Occupy and everything kicked off, and the pepper spraying here at Davis is sort of, I think, our most infamous moment. I came in right after a bunch of union reformers with Academic Workers for a Democratic Union, also known as AWDU, had taken over the union, and I was unit chair from 2012 to 2014. And so, this is my particular take on this. I think our union's strongest when there's a polyvocality, right, of various of viewpoints and histories. So I'm hoping to add to a sort of collective storytelling of the history of what's, what has taken place. So there's a lot to go over. I'm gonna probably end up going really fast through some parts of this because I spent the whole weekend trying to whittle this down, and there's still too much here. But I have the full slides up just because I'm like, you know what, instead of just like cutting out all of these, I'll just leave them up and I can share the slides. So if people want to like look at things longer, then that's fine. But I will be going through some of this kind of fast because I'm really not sure if I can do this in 40 minutes, but I'm going to try my absolute best to try to do that. So I just want to start off with, so this is not just a history, but it's a sociological history, right? 'Cause I'm in the sociology department. And so when we talk about social movements, what do we mean by social movement? And a definition that I got from Tim Gutierrez when I was teeing for him long ago in the labor class, and I don't remember where he got it from, so that's why I'm citing him, it's a specific form of collective social action in which excluded or marginalized groups with a shared sense of purpose and solidarity mobilize themselves to affect change and achieve specific goals through extra institutional channels. And it's going to be that last part that I think is really most important for me here. What defines a social movement is particularly that it is outside of, the currently existing institutional channels. And so that's going to be a sort of a big distinction I'm trying to make here, is that the labor movement and organized labor aren't necessarily always the same exact thing. That there's the labor movement, right, which is anytime workers sort of collectively engage in any kind of action, and that can include workers who are not currently unionized. And then there's organized labor, right, where there's unions, which are, sort of like the nonprofit industrial complex side of things, right? And they're not always engaging in movement activities because they often are working through institutional channels that were set up back in the days of the New Deal. So organized labor and the labor movement, there can be massive overlap or little overlap depending on what's going on. And so I think the question a lot of people are wondering about in labor sociology and in labor history is trying to understand why we once had this very mass militant movement of working people in this country with its ups and downs. But what we've seen for decades now, despite the fact that we have unions, is that we've seen this massive decline both in union membership, but also just in the actual movement of labor itself. That there's a lot less, for a long time there's a lot less mass strikes, and we don't have the kind of militancy that we once did. And so trying to understand I think it's important to talk about this distinction and connection, right, between the labor movement and organized labor. And so some of the things people talk about as to why the labor movement has declined focuses on the shift toward neoliberal state policy. Really going back to Taft-Hartley, we see the beginning of laws that are very hostile toward organized labor and toward the working class in general. The neoliberalism with its deregulation and lack of enforcement of current laws, and as well as just defunding the public sector, which has a lot of union jobs. Obviously, that shapes the terrain and has been incredibly detrimental. But the other thing that some labor scholars are looking at is the structure of unions themselves. They're saying, is there something maybe in the way in which unions have been structured, which has been a hinder toward actually channeling social movement activity? And so I want to kind of lay down a theoretical framework that I'm using here. And so we'll talk about very briefly about models of unionism, right? There's numerous terms that are used. I don't think there's really a standardized way of talking about things. People, I think, often kind of come up with their own definitions of things. And so sometimes there's people kind of talking past each other. But terms that you might hear, things like business unionism or the service model or turnkey unionism, and even the so-called organizing model of SEIU, hasn't really been much of a break from the actual the very top-down bureaucratic structures of unions, even if it often takes, somewhat more militant and more active of a role compared to the sort of service model and turnkey unionism that they were trying to break from. So I'm not going to go through all this, it's too much right now, but basically I'm kind of working from setting up Weberian ideal types, right? So at each end of a spectrum here, one, we have business unionism with various characteristics that sort of make up the ideal type of a business union, and social movement unionism. Everything in the real world is obviously some mixture of the two, but it's about how close are you on one end or the other. So it's not a binary. I just want to make that clear that this is rather a spectrum between these two things that we're trying to look at here, and that really, for me, the main difference can be, we can find, or I try to pinpoint the main difference in two different ways. One is whose agency is centered. So with an advocacy type model, which is often what business unionism is, right, is I am doing this on your behalf. With the setting up of labor law, right, you now had to have a class of experts, right? The reps who know the contract, and they maybe have some legal training, and they're the ones with the full-time jobs that are doing things on your behalf. I will, we'll do this for you. You let us know what the grievance is. We'll go file this thing. We'll talk to management. So there's the advocacy model, and advocacy is not necessarily always a bad thing, right? If I were to get arrested, I want to make sure that I have somebody from the National Lawyers Guild there. I want a good lawyer, right? And so in certain areas and for certain populations, advocacy can, be very useful. But I'm sort of trying to contrast that to organizing, which is, instead of I'm doing this on your behalf, this is more of a we're doing this together. I keep, sorry, whenever I share screen, I can't see the chat, and I know things are popping up, so I'm just going to keep going, and at the end I can try to answer questions. I don't know if any of that's toward me or if you're all just talking to each other. So again, trying to create something of a distinction here, right, between orientations toward whose agency is being centered. And that, I think, goes perfectly in line with, again, this orientation toward the institution, right? I'm an advocate. I'm going to work through these particular institutional channels that have been set up, right, for us to sort of work out these various conflicts on your behalf. And then on the other side of things, right, you have social movements that work outside of institutional channels and are based on collective action. And like I said, it's not always a perfect binary, but we're trying to set up sort of ideal types to be able to sort of measure things up against. And so I think this is, for me, the big distinction between the two models here. And so labor scholars and historians will often look at, the passage of the New Deal as sort of providing not just the laws and the various, like rules in which labor needs to operate, but also looking at the development over the next couple decades and saying that there's, that there's this development of this material basis for the emergence of a union bureaucracy. And so they point toward various things such as, things like AWDUS checkoff, right? That now you can have a group of people who, have a financial base of members that they don't necessarily have a relationship with, right? And they can, like any advocacy group, they can sort of do things on the behalf of other people. And the contracts, right, sort of sets up, you need an expertise in labor law, that you have what used to be outright conflicts on the shop floor, now being channeled into formal grievance procedures, and the normalization of no strikes clauses, right? This moving from unions administering labor instead of agitating labor. And it's not that the winds of the New Deal were bad by any means, but it should be. I think the more radical take is that these things were concessions, but they ended up having, they were sort of a double-edged sword that ended up having something of a disciplining effect on labor itself. And so Kim Moody and others talk about the material basis for the emergence of this bureaucracy. And he says the leadership and its army of reps was transformed into a distinct social layer based in the union organization itself. And so over the period of the 60s and into the 70s, or to the late 60s and 70s, what we have is this sort of bifurcation, this conflict between this distinct social layer, this union bureaucracy, and the rank and file members themselves. And so there's this period that Moody calls the long 70s, in which we see a rise of wildcat strikes, a sharp rise in the number of contracts that are rejected, or tentative agreements, right, that are rejected, and the rise of more contested elections and independent rank and file reform caucuses. And all of these only make sense if we understand it as a response to the rise of union bureaucracy, the sort of big, top-down nature and undemocratic nature of unions, that it's the rejection of that undemocratic bureaucratic leadership that workers are sort of rebelling against in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. And so reform caucuses at this time, such as Miners for a Democratic Union, there's the Revolutionary Union Movement, which as UAW members, I hope everybody has heard of. If not, you should read Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. It's an excellent book about radical Black workers in Detroit in the 70s. And other groups like Upsurge at UPS, Teamsters for a Democratic Union, and United Action and AFT. And then in modern times, there's Educators for a Democratic Union, there's MORE, and there's CORE, all in teachers' unions. We're seeing a lot of this happening in teachers' unions today. And so again, another great Moody quote here, just to kind of develop the theoretical perspective that I'm using here, is that the union officials' very success in subduing their own militant base in the struggle to secure their own power and material base was thus a fundamental factor in weakening many of the labor movement's strongest unions. And so part of the reason why neoliberalism has been able to take on, has been able to be so successful and go unchallenged is because there was an opposition to it in the late 60s and into the 70s by the not just organized labor, but by the labor movement. But unfortunately, there was a disciplining of labor by the very structures that were supposed to set up to be advocates for or to help channel that type of activity. And so there's this struggle between the rank and file and the bureaucracy the bureaucracy ends up winning, and that itself ends up sort of de-radicalizing the labor movement, and is partly why we get the 80s and the rise of Reaganism and such. So taking that sort of I hope this isn't too quick. I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible because there's just so much to talk about. But I want to take that perspective and apply it to 2865. So it's important to recognize that why are we with United Auto Workers? In part, this once militant union that's known for its sit-down strikes in the 30s, had very much become a bureaucratized top-down union. And as we all know now, as it's constantly making news headlines, right, that it's also incredibly corrupt. That the failure of the success of the bureaucracy in disciplining the radical rank and file and such instances as the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement and others meant that the union itself was really incapable of fighting back against deindustrialization and neoliberalism. And so the UAW's membership declined from a peak of about 1.5 million in 1979 down to less than 400,000 in 2011. And there's a pretty sharp decline that began during the 80s. And so in order to make up for the loss of this material base, the UAW begins to look outside of its traditional workforce. And so the UAW is actually as far as I know, the union that represents more grad students than any other union. So right, this is a sector that they've sort of been moving into for decades now. Our union itself has a long history. Thanks to Mandy Cohen for a lot of the history that work that she did that I'm drawing on here. We have a history of trying to unionize that goes back to the 30s. But really, after the passage of HERA, the Higher Education Employee Relations Act in 1979 in California, graduate students began to try to unionize. The UC says, no, this law doesn't apply to you. You're not employees, you're apprentices, right? If anyone who's been involved in the researchers campaign in the last few years knows that, because that was extended to them up until much more recently. And so it took until 1998 when there's this big UC-wide strike on all 8 campuses, and 8 because Merced doesn't exist yet. Finals week strike across the state to really pressure both the UC and the Public Employee Relations Board to recognize us as employees. And this is when finally PERB says, no, you have to recognize them except for research assistants. And so that continued on for another couple decades. But within a few years, this once radical union had sort of transformed, right? There's high turnover in graduate schools, so there's a lack of institutional memory. And what you had was a very top-down sort of bureaucratic shell of an organization that's really focused on bringing in dues and VCAP money for the international. It is really being run by our international rep, Mike Miller, and a few other reps that we had at the time as well. I think last I knew we're down to just him, but we used to have multiple UAW international reps working with our local. And so there was a lot of, under the surface rank and file discontent. And there's a whole history here of a lot of that, but again, I'm trying to cut through to make this as quick as possible. So skip forward to 2010, and this is just after the 2009 UC student movement against austerity and privatization, right, where you have the UC pushing austerity and raising tuition, and the students respond with massive building occupations and massive rallies and such. That the union at the time was not really involved in, and sort of on the heels of that, the union leadership itself sort of internalizes the austerity logic and says, well, our members think that given the budget cuts, it would be selfish to ask for a raise right now. So there was, they tried to negotiate and settle a contract over the summer that a lot of people felt was concessionary. And so there's this, sort of emergency organizing around to voting no on contract ratification. And from this, we get the Academic Workers for Democratic Union caucus born or founded or whatever in 2010 at Berkeley, that then spreads across all UC campuses. The no votes lose, and the contract is ratified. But this then sort of becomes the network that will then go on to, in 2011, just some months later, end up sweeping the union election, but not after a highly contested process in which the vote count is stopped once it becomes apparent that AWDUS is going to win, and they just locked the ballot boxes away in the union office and walked away. And so then the student movement tactics that, you know, a lot of the people that were involved with this sort of first generation of AWDU were highly involved in the student movement, then spills over into the union reform movement itself. And people actually occupy the union office and demand that the ballots be counted. And eventually the ballots were counted, and AWDU won and swept to the executive board and has a majority on the joint council. And this is a great video. I'm not going to show it because we don't have time for it. But this is Mandy, who helped with the, you know, I drew on her history for the pre-recognition history here. You should check it out. I will share the slides after. So then we get to 2011 with AWDU in power. And so the union, the AWDU tries to reform the union by, you know, doing various things such as not consolidating all the power into the president, but rather the e-boards run more like a council. And campuses are provided with more autonomy, both in, you know, budgets, right before part of this, something that I would have shown if I was doing like a long version of this is this ridiculous back and forth between Sarah Smith, who was at UC Santa Cruz, just asking for colored paper. And there's just this tedious back and forth about, Sarah, you have to promise that you're only going to print things and use the colored paper to print projects that the president has okayed. And they're like, we have a lot of things going on locally here that we just want some colored paper so we can print some things, right? And so that kind of tedium of a highly centralized power structure was something that AWDU was like, we need to break this up. We need to empower the campuses who are doing the, you know, where the organizing is actually happening, empower them with both the money, you know, the ability to spend money and to make decisions about what they're doing with that. The other things like term limits put into the bylaws, and as well as elections changing from once every 3 years to once every 2 years. So that way leadership's being rotated. So that way, you know, because I think the two words here that I would also, if I'm going to do, you know, go along this ideal type thing, is sort of formal democracy versus participatory democracy. And, you know, the very first generation of AWDU that ran, their whole thing was, I'm just running once and then I'm done. You know, we want to keep rotating leadership and developing leadership instead of just having a small crew of people hanging around for a long time running everything. And other things, this is just choice, this isn't everything. The development of an anti-oppression committee that was funded, and so, you know, to really make sure that the union wasn't only focusing on sort of bread and butter class issues, but was really centering anti-oppression work. And so AWDU does a lot of solidarity work with Occupy, around work with undergrads around UC healthcare issues. We became the first local in the United States. The IWW as a whole had already joined the BDS movement, but we became the first local in the US to join the BDS movement, which a year later, the international UAW then overturned simply on political grounds. They said the vote was legit and it was democratic, but they disagree with it. They think it would hurt the weapons manufacturers and other defense contractors and such that we have members working in. And, you know, we're involved with many social movements that were happening at the time, like Black Lives Matter. And we made quite the shock throughout the labor movement and really started a lot of conversations about the connection between police and the labor movement. When our local called on the AFL-CIO to expel police unions, saying that police unions are inherently anti-Black and inherently anti-labor, as our early history would show. But now police unions are part of organized labor, not the labor movement, but part of organized labor. And again, that's why I think it's important to have that distinction. Like I said, there's overlap, but they're not exactly the same. And part of this experiment, and it was an experiment, different people in different campuses with different politics, different conditions on each campus, made each campus's experiment a little bit different. But statewide contract negotiations was very much one model. And it was basically, we're going to have open bargaining. We're going to view the bargaining room not as a place where you can sit down and chat with management and convince them. If you just come up with just a clever enough argument or show just enough data, right? Which I think for a lot of us in the sciences and others, right, there's this idea that discourse, and that you can compel others to seeing your argument. But I think the idea that we had on the AWDU bargaining team was that this is about power, and that the management has a very different economic and material and social interests than we do, and that the bargaining room isn't a place to actually sit down and haggle, but it is a space that we're going to use to continue to agitate the membership. And so we had open bargaining for the first time, and it was also a space where we could show that look, we are building toward a credible strike. We have, hundreds of members coming out and filling the bargaining room. And so management doesn't just have to wonder about, what we're doing on the ground, but they can see it. And so we're showing that we have a credible strike threat. This was something where we had open committees, so that way members could try to shape the very contract campaign itself. And we went on strike for the first time in like a decade or something. And there were various social justice wins and a pay raise of 5,443. And this is from an article by Sean and Natasha, who are AWDU NYU members, that was published in Jacobin, called "Who's Afraid of the Rank and File?" And the red line here, this is the real wages. And we can see, unfortunately, this was published in like 2017 or 2018. So it unfortunately isn't up to date. But this contract was by far, above the zero line here is a real raise, right? Anything else, inflation sort of eats up. And so this was the first contract with a real solid, wage increase, which is not to say that, there aren't other things like childcare subsidies and tuition remission, but just as far as wages goes, this was the first wage increase that was, real solid wage increase for the whole life of the contract. And so, like I said, the sort of difference, again, was sort of the difference between advocacy and organizing, right? That previously it was a small group of people in a closed bargaining saying, we're going to talk to management, we're going to advocate for these things for you, versus a collective action that says, we're going to let the on the ground game sort of drive what happens in bargaining. And I know I'm kind of blowing through some of this, but I think I'm probably going, okay, there's a lot to talk about, sorry. And from this, a lot of people were inspired, graduate students at other locals were very inspired by the contract campaign, by us going out on strike multiple times, once on a sympathy strike with AFSCME, and then once on our own. And then we see the spreading of AWDU to other UAW graduate student locals. So there's AWDU at UMass Amherst, NYU, Washington University, and Columbia. Right, and that's something that it happens because of the, people saw what was going on, and they said, we agree with this way of doing things. And then there's sort of a transitionary period, and that sort of leads to where we are now in the union. And so my argument here, again, this is my perspective, is that what ended up happening was, there was basically, like Naomi Klein talks about the shock doctrine. We essentially had a sort of discursive shock doctrine where the threat, or the perceived threat, of the Janus versus AFSCME decision, which was a Supreme Court decision that at the time hadn't been ruled yet, but now it's been ruled, and it essentially got rid of the what we call agency fee, right, where non-members still pay a smaller amount to the union. And it was sort of being talked about, not just in our local, but across public sector unions, as a sort of like doomsday thing, right? That once this happens, this is the end of public sector unions in this country. And that happened some years ago, and public sector unions are still here. So it certainly wasn't doomsday, or if it was a very slow one. But that was used to sort of justify a series of reforms, such as the professionalization of the union, right? Hiring outside professional staffers that were making $60,000 to $80,000 a year. I should say they weren't making $60,000 to $80,000. I assure you, they're definitely much better paid than that. Making $60,000 to $80,000 a year, And so, right, thinking back to Moody, we're talking about a distinct social layer. So these are people that don't have, they don't actually have quote unquote skin in the game, right? They're not under our working conditions. They're not people who were TAs and are going to be TAs again. And they're making 3 to 4 times a year what we make. And so they're, not that class, right, in a Marxist sense, certainly isn't purely about economics, it's about relationship to means of production, but somebody who's making 60 to 80 grand a year probably has somewhat of a different social position to some degree than somebody who's making 20 grand a year. And through the unionization of the professional staff, we end up with a situation where the president is having basically full authority over the staff, at least for a while. People can talk about what's happened more recently. I did attend an OC meeting where it does seem like a lot of the critiques here, things may be changing for the better. But at the very least, I'm talking about 2018, 2017 into 2018. We see that before, when we were investing in members, right, so we had elected positions like unit chairs and other positions, for instance, the AOC coordinator, these were elected positions where we're investing in members and developing member leaders. So not only have we shifted to hiring full-time staffers who are outside of, they're non-members, but also getting rid of unit chair fee remission, right, was part of we need to save money because Janice is going to come by and it's going to devastate us. And getting rid of a lot of the campus autonomy around budgets. I won't go too much into this because I think Sheila might end up talking about this. I don't know what the talk specifically is going to address, but basically defunding and marginalizing the anti-oppression committee coordinator position and the AOC in general. And opposing affirmative action in hiring, which wasn't really an issue before because these were elected positions, but if we're going to be hiring people, maybe we should have a stance on affirmative action. And really what it all comes down to is membership cards sort of being viewed as the sole metric through which we understand whether the union is strong, whether the union is democratic, or whether we have a powerful union. I think membership cards are one of a variety of metrics that you could use to measure, right? It's not that they have no significance, but would ask yourself if you'd rather be in a union with 100% membership, but it's only really run by a couple of people. People are generally not aware of what's going on. It's not militant at all. Or if you'd rather be in a union that has less than a majority membership, right, and so is struggling to even say that we represent a full majority of members, but has built on the ground connections and has built a real what the word union actually used to mean, right, is sort of like all of the workers themselves, right, a collective of workers willing to engage in collective action and militantly and going on strike and doing things. So this is sort of the union on paper versus union on the ground. And again, you can't have both, right? So it's, again, these aren't, it's not a binary, but if you're only using membership cards as really the metric that you really are trying to understand what is the state of things right now, it can be misleading, is I think the best way to put it. That there's lots of other factors that you need to consider. And I just talked about all that, so skip that. And so what ended up happening was in August of 2018, we went to the situation where the bargaining team comes up and says, we have a tentative agreement with management and we want a straw poll from the members to see if this is worth voting on to ratify. And people have some issues with this because, one, UC Merced didn't have any reps on the bargaining team at the time, so they had no representation in this process when that happened. The bargaining team agreement itself said a majority was 10 because we have 18 reps, but it passes at the time with a majority of those present, but not with the 10. And there are various other things that some people, such as myself, would argue were violations of the bylaws as well as the bargaining team agreements. And so critics of what happened here will, I've heard some people say this is sort of like a last minute coup. And I think that puts all of the agency on a couple individuals and says like, oh, well, these people were doing these things and they were bad or something. Whereas my argument is more of an organizational one. I say, well, if what we have is a sort of, in the face of a perceived threat of Janus versus AFSCME, we adopt more business union-like organizing practices and more of that kind of a model, then it can be understood that that's the perspective that's going in to bargaining. And so there's not really this belief that the rank and file can engage in a successful strike, because if you only really looking at membership percentages, and that's the yardstick that you're using, then people who are reading Jane McAlevey, who says you have to have a strong majority, a supermajority maybe even, to have a successful strike, are looking at our union and saying, we've had a decline in membership numbers over the last few years. We really need to focus on just membership numbers, and so we're unfortunately weaker than we've ever been. People who are looking at a matrix of metrics would say, yes, well, what happened was people put time into actually building an on-the-ground union and not just going and collecting cards. So there was a decline in membership, not on every campus, but statewide there was a decline in membership. And yes, but minority strikes historically can and are or can be very successful, and are actually an important part of building a union. Research, labor scholars point to the role of minority strikes actually in building a strong majority fighting union. And so, this is, I think, more of about organizational perspectives than it was about, a last minute coup or people, sort of being devious. I think this was really just about fundamentally a view of how to understand what a union is and how to go about organizing. And it's maybe not as sexy as calling it a coup, but I think that it's more sociological. And again, this is just my personal take. And so what members were told by the union on the ballot itself that if we don't settle for this contract now, this would financially spell doom for the union. We might not have a union in a year. And so again, there's sort of a scramble for a no vote around this contract. People wanted to fight, right? They said, if this is what management's willing to give us before we've even called for a strike authorization vote, what if we spend a little more time? There's other unions on campus that are going on strike. And what if we fight for something more? We might be able to win more than what they've given us already. And so, there's this sort of this scramble, and the no votes lose out. The contract ends up getting ratified. And like I said, there's various rules that people would allege were broken. To people such as myself, there's the Mussman appeal. People say, hey, all of this kind of went down in a kind of shady way, and the Mussman appeal is overturned by I don't know if that's the word, rejected, not overturned, rejected by the executive board. And so that we now end up, we have the contract that we have today, for the next 3 years. And so, my argument would be if we can see a parallel here, right, to what's going on in the 1970s, where you have this development of this distinct social layer of a bureaucracy and things being run more top down, and the focus being on, membership numbers as opposed to a sort of more dynamic understanding of what's happening on the ground. And again, not necessarily pure dichotomy, but as a matter of degrees, then, the wildcat strikes, the contract rejections, and the reform caucuses that emerge in the labor movement in the 70s, we can see the COLA wildcat as something that emerges in response to this recent series of reforms put out, from 2017 to 2018 under OSWP. And so, at UC Santa Cruz, around 85% of graduate students voted no on the contract. And so it's sort of, I think, a no-brainer as to why a wildcat strike happened there. because, right, this was already a place where graduate students were not satisfied with the contract. And, you know, they probably, if they had been able to go on strike, and I don't think that we would have been able to win a full COLA in 2018, but at least, you know, if you win something more, you can say, hey, we've tried, this is what we've won. And I won't go into too much more because I was actually financially displaced and was living 3,000 miles away while COLA happened. I'm sure there's people here who were around during that time. And I've definitely gone over my time. So I'm going to end it here, and I will let other people who are around talk more about COLA and you know, things more recently. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Connor. I mean, thanks, Duane. Thanks, Connor, too. But thank you for that rich history. And so we'll open it up to questions. Just wanted to say, if folks wanted to introduce yourselves on chat, like just put in, you know, pronouns, names, departments, how you came here as Q&A is happening, that would be great. Put any questions in there as well, or just, I think it's a small group. You can raise your hand. Or just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hey everybody, this is Beezer. This has been such a powerful conversation, and some of you I'm familiar with. I joined UC Berkeley at the same time Duane did, and fought alongside Duane and many others for some of these powerful reforms. I'm wondering, Duane, if you can speak a little bit to also the dynamics within the UC system itself, which I think have a shaping factor on some of the things that played out in the union. For instance, just the rapid growth in the STEM field and the ways that budgets were allocated, which had a kind of impact on some of the more working class students in different departments like Black studies and gender and women's studies, sociology, often being more mobilized to be part of the union fight, but also impacting the membership numbers and the perception of like a shrinking union when there's really something happening at a much higher level in the university. I'm wondering if you can kind of just talk about, I guess, university finance and the ways that that shaped some of the union dynamics, and what the struggles ahead also look like as people start to think about austerity projects within the university.
Should I respond right away, or are we taking a few questions? How's this going?
I think we can respond right away, Duane, and that'll give people a chance to also ferment new questions. Thank you.
Okay, sure. I mean, yeah, I think I don't think I have too much more to add to that than what you've said. I haven't been able to go through. I don't know where those numbers are and where I can find those. But certainly, you know, the changes that happen within the university, I think, are definitely both the structural changes, but also just the social movements that happen as well in response. So like I had sort of touched on very briefly, like the 2009 to 10 social movements of the anti-privatization, anti-austerity undergraduate movements. The graduate students that were involved in that ended up, that sort of energy and radicalism sort of spilled over into the union. And so I think that you know, if I had like 2 hours, we could go through and we could talk about like both the structural changes that are happening within the UC, what's going on within the, you know, within the university community and outside of it too, right? Like when Ferguson happened, that, you know, and Occupy and things that are happening off campus, you know, inspire things to happen on campus as well. And so I think there's a lot more, and I really tried to keep it brief, and I went over time as it was. But I would love to hear more, instead of it being more of like question and then I try to answer. I'd really just love to hear more of a conversation between the folks that are here.
Hey, thanks for your talk. That was really.
If anyone has a direct response.
Oh, I don't have a direct response, so.
Go ahead, Michael. The floor is yours.
Yeah, no, sure. Thanks. So it seems like one of the major tactical problems or questions that your talk raises is whether it makes sense at all to try to work within the union, which is to say, we can point to historical examples of successful minority strikes, right? We can get all of our departments, quote, strike ready. I don't think UAW 2865 will ever authorize a strike, right? That's my personal opinion. But people seem to differ on this point, and I guess I just answered my own question. But it seems difficult, right? Whether we should put any energy at all into trying to get the leadership of UAW 2865 to authorize a strike over the summer, or whether we should continue to build independent power structures. And this isn't, I guess they're not mutually exclusive, but I guess I was curious about your take on that. Because they just have so many resources too, right? That's what's terrifying. Like I remember during COLA, my department organization met to talk about getting UCI composition to strike in sympathy, and they sent a paid staffer to diffuse our meeting and to sabotage it, right? So when you have that kind of, those kinds of resources, right, it's hard to do battle with them, as pretty much everyone here probably knows, right? But at the same time, it's hard to build that organic extrinsic structure. Anyway, I'm just rambling now, but thanks for the talk, and that was kind of my question.
Yeah, I'll just say that personally, I think it's easier to, if you're building something that's strong enough to really really fight back against the university, you've probably also built something strong enough to be able to win elected leadership in the union. And so I think that, you know, like you said, the resources that could be used against you versus you using those resources to help you know, your objectives. I think personally, I'm a, you know, reform the institution. That's my position. I know there are others, and I understand that there are people who, in certain particular cases, might have felt like this is a space that they couldn't go to for various reasons, because of you know, microaggressions or toxic cultures and things like that. And so they, you know, I'm not trying to judge people who are taking on, there's a whole lot of work. Ultimately, I think that like there's a whole lot of work out there. The whole world is kind of fucked up, right? And so wherever you're doing your organizing, finding people that, comrades that you can work alongside with, that's a good thing. I personally don't want to give up on the you know, reforming 2865 project.
Duane, I don't know if you can see, there was a question in the chat that kind of is a good transition to where you just were. Can you see it? I could read it out to you if you want.
Is this about negotiations in the no strike clause?
Yeah.
That one, yeah. So yeah, no strikes clauses are standard in you know, in labor relations. You know, almost every union has a no strike clause these days. They entered the labor movement around the time of World War II, right? As sort of like a, you know, we have to defeat the Nazis, we have to win the war effort, and we can't have strikes happening and stuff like that. And so these are pretty standard. So I haven't gone back and seen the old contracts, but I imagine it was probably in the first one. I'm sure I know where to look to find that information. But that's pretty standard stuff. And it's something that, you know, we often talked about is like, could we get rid of this no strikes clause? How much, you know, how much would we really have to fight management to get that removed? Or are there clever ways of sort of working around it? Like the dock workers have like a thing where they're like, if there's like a dangerous situation, which could just be people protesting outside of the port, then we're allowed to just go home. And so they can essentially tell the community like, hey, there's this ship that is coming into port that you all oppose because you're Palestinian solidarity activists. If you protest in front, we can shut the port down. So there's like ways around it too. So that's my thing on the no strikes clause. And then as far as contract negotiations go, and not having a repeat of the 2018 negotiation or settlement, well, I would say there's two parts to that. One, if the bargaining team you know, has a different perspective on the capacity of the union to strike or not, that alone would be, right, something different. But if the same perspective is taken, then it would really just be up to the rank and file members to sort of pressure them to push for more, right? So ultimately, I think it always just comes down to a well-organized rank and file. There's no way around that.
Just
And
on a
to answer the question about the oh, sorry, go ahead.
And no, just to your point of a well-organized rank and file, I think I wanted to talk a little bit about your thought, which was nice and nuanced about how certain things that went down in 2018, it's easy to, you know, be like, these were insidious actors and they did these individual kind of evil acts, which, you know, isn't necessarily inaccurate or whatever. There's different takes, but I think maybe something that we all would agree on is that if we're not well organized and we're not in communication and we all are just focusing on, you know, filling out cards and signing up members and not actually knowing what's going on in our union, then nobody's going to know when things like that happen, whether or not, you know, that's the only explanation for what goes down. So I just wanted to flesh that out a little.
Thank you. And I just wanted to give a real quick answer to the question about our affiliation with the UAW in general. In order to affiliate with a different union, we would have to first have a decertification vote. And then you'd have to have another vote to certify to be part of a different union. And those alone would require, I think, a lot of time and energy and really a mass base. And that, you know, it was something that we used to actually openly talk about, you know, in joint council meetings right in front of Mike Miller, our international rep, who wasn't very happy about those conversations. But I think people always sort of felt like, is that really where our time and energy should be going? As long as we've sort of got control of our local, you know, we started to connect up with other dissident groups, such as the Auto Workers Caravan, which is like dissident auto workers in the UAW. And so maybe waiting for more of a particular moment where you could sort of try to leverage that relationship. But I think that, yeah, the answer to that is it hasn't happened. And, you know, the chance that it will happen soon, I think, is very unlikely because it's a lot of work. And it's like, would you rather organize to change your working conditions or organize to be under a different union? And I think for even the people who are the most critical of the international would still say, I don't know if this is really worth our time, but you know, this is my last funded quarter as a TA, so this is all up to you all now.
Okay, I have a question. If I don't want to derail the conversation, but I think something that emerged during the COLA movement was the possibility for like undergraduate alliances, and I'm wondering if there's something we can envision going forward, especially towards next year, that would potentially like exploit that leverage. I've been thinking about it, but I think you've got probably a lot more to say about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I've talked a little bit about the connections between grad student and grad student union organization, militancy, and undergraduate movement militancy, and I think there's a very strong connection there. And you know, that's why I think a lot of us in AWDUS spent a lot of time working alongside undergraduate activists, is because you know, when one side is strong, the other side gets stronger. But also, I think part of this also is like, this gets to the question of the particular perspective that was used in 2018 as to why we shouldn't go on strike, which is about this, you know, you need a majority. And, you know, I think one of the ultimate flaws of that to me is that it's completely arbitrary in that, right, if the idea is you can only have a strong strike if you have a majority, well, the thing is, even if 100%, and literally, like, this probably would never happen, but imagine 100% of UAW 20, not just UAW 2065 members, but every single academic student employee, all ASCs, everyone who's covered by the contract goes out on strike. That's still not actually majority strike because we have what's called craft unionism at the UC, and we don't have industrial unionism. So it's not even a majority of the actual UC workers, right? So it's sort of this arbitrary line between us and the other workers. A real majority strike could involve a minority of 2065 members, or you know, a majority of members, but a minority of the full, you know, in-unit people, along with a whole bunch of other unions, right? And so this connection, you know, is, to me, to try to get to your question, Toby, is like, it's thinking about both undergraduates and other workers. And ultimately, there's this great book called Reviving the Strike. I think it tends to, my one critique about it real quick is that I think it tends to focus too much only on class issues. That aside, though, it's a great read. Because it talks about different types of strikes, right? A strike isn't just a strike. And back in the day, we used to have these things called mass strikes, where you would get not just the workers that were, you know, working at, say, the factory to go on strike, but the whole community would come out and they would shut down the factory gates, right? And so that now that there's this sort of like neoliberal strike where you're like, well, we're gonna stand outside peacefully with these picket signs and let scab workers come in and take our place, but they'll be more expensive than us. And right, and so like obviously there's a spectrum again between like that and that, and we don't ever have scabs replacing us, so that's not necessarily something that that we do in higher ed, but you know, that there's different types of strikes, and that ultimately the ones that historically have been the strongest are ones that really are about class organization, not just about union organization, but organizing the broad class, right, of workers in the community. And so I think, you know, we need to build strong connections with other unions and undergraduates.
Can I ask a question?
Sheila, you want?
It feels like cheating because I've like given some version of this presentation. But how does business unionism respond to rank and file rebellions?
Well, in my dissertation, 3 things that I identified in Seattle that I'm sort of seeing pop up again from my COLA interviews. I interviewed 20 people that were involved in the COLA movement across the UC, is that what we see end up happening is sort of in response to these wildcat, you know, strikes and these types of rank and file rebellions, is that, you know, bureaucratic union leadership will respond by trying to contain it, right, to make sure it doesn't spread to other places. So in Seattle, right, it was just this one high school and they tried to prevent it from spreading to other places. You know, they didn't want other schools engaging in this test boycott, which it was a partial strike, a wildcat partial strike. You know, trying to just keep it where it is, don't let it spread, and then, you know, try to contain it, try to demobilize, right? Try to say, you're not allowed to do this, this violates labor law, you shouldn't be doing this, this is scary, right? And then going even beyond that to, this is anti-union, you're going to hurt us, you know, wildcats only hurt the union, that type of stuff, to try to demobilize. Other attempts to demobilize would be to say things like, oh, hey, we've won, right? So like in Seattle, they were like, oh, hey, you know, the administration came out and said, well, they're not going to stop giving that test right now, but there's this committee that's going to look into stopping giving the standardized test, right? Because they're just like, we don't want to do the standardized test anymore. And then the union president steps out and says, we've won, everybody, congrats, go back, you know, everything's fine, you can give the test now, and then it'll get worked out in the committee. So steering things into committees and things like that, right, back into the bureaucratic channels. So, you know, there's contain, there's demobilize, and then there's co-op. So once you can't demobilize and once it begins to spread, and it looks like it's beginning to succeed, to then step out and say, we were doing this all along, we supported this all along, look at us. And that was something that happened in Seattle too, was the union president actually started to take credit for the test boycott that they tried to stop. He went around and said, well, in the very beginning of the year, I went around to schools and I said, you know, what is something that you care about? What is your biggest grievance? And a lot of people said, you know, this test, I don't like the MAP test. And so then it was like trying to take credit for the test boycott that they opposed. And so I think these are three common things that, that I'm seeing between these two cases. And there may very well be other ways in which they respond, but those are the three that I've identified.
Can I add another one that I observed during COLA? Is that, as I mentioned before, we had a kind of a composition independent group that was not affiliated with the union that did things like demand handbook changes to protect students against sexual harassment, things that the UAW historically has not grieved, like has refused to grieve. And when they do grieve, it's a public process and terrible, right? In any event, they basically, after COLA, after the Thermidor, like waged war on the group and basically effectively got it shut down in English just by being terrible people and getting elected, taking over meetings, being really just terrible and mean. And it was just like, and they imploded their own group, And so it seems like they're also interested in waging war on anything that's not the union. And the way they sleep at night, I guess, is that the union should mediate all ties, right, in the workplace. But it seems like the, OSWP also relies upon the fiction that we are two different statuses, that we are students and workers, right? But at the same time want to collapse that distinction when it benefits their own power and accumulation of power. Anyway, that's just something I've observed, that they seem to actively be waging war on other spaces as well.
I don't know where our moderator is, but if that's the end of the questions, I don't know if people want to call it there.
I don't think we can call it until there's like a conversation around what people are wanting to dream up for this union going forward. I guess I'm just curious about that future oriented direction, especially like Michael, you asked some really powerful things about whether it's possible to organize within a formation like that, or where the movement energy is. And I don't know, I guess if anybody doesn't have any other questions, I would love to just hear from folks, kind of open it up and hear what people think about that. I just quickly private messaged Michael, but I was like, that the situation that you described sounds a lot like 2009, right? When there was an entrenched union leadership that really was not invested in the anti-austerity organizing that was like really bubbling up out of necessity. And like Duane's sharing, right? Sometimes people have to organize kind of militant formations outside of the formal structure, but there's a lot of power when people can mobilize through those organizations, and it's very useful. Those communication channels alone were so useful for communicating across the state and really building a body that could do solidarity strikes, anti-fascist strikes, like a lot of possibility once people were able to mobilize through those channels. So I hope people don't give up on the project.
Yeah, I have to go too, but I also thought that what Michael, I think it was Michael said, really resonated for, I don't know, I know everybody's at different levels of involvement with this, but they're definitely not above being super duper mean. So, and it's completely fine if, you're a sensitive person and you're not ready for that. So just prepare yourself. I know that I got some feelings hurt. So, maybe there are some experts in our community on building up against that, because it really takes a toll over time, especially. I don't know, there's a lot of really great professional experience in our community. So maybe drawing on some of those resources and maybe finding community ways to compensate for them too would be a good way to build strength over time.
I do have a question actually that kind of follows up on Beezer's question as well, which is really about like what next, like what comes next, like especially with bargaining right now and with UCF, with the AFT going on strike, like what is happening on other campuses, or what might be strategies or like next steps that we could take to kind of build upon all of this, especially from those who've had experience already. What do next steps look like?
Yeah, so, like I said, I think the more that people are building the networks of folks that they feel like they can organize with and are like-minded enough, that you can develop a network of people who maybe have a similar vision for what you want to get out of the next round of bargaining, or whatever it is, and trying to connect up, because I think there's a lot of disparate networks, small clumps of people maybe that are concerned about this issue or that issue or these different things, but they aren't necessarily connected up, either because they've just never been involved in the union so much, or maybe they used to be, but they felt kind of pushed out, or whatever it is. And I think, or it could even be people that are even currently working with the union, but are a little critical of it, right? There's, I think, many different types of places where people are at, but connecting up those networks and really doing that rank and file organizing, so that way it's not like back in 2010 or back in 2018 where there's just sort of last minute, oh shoot, we need to organize a no vote, but how do we do that given that we're just a whole bunch of decentralized, disconnected individuals who don't have access to mass email lists or anything, right? And so I think that ultimately what is good for moving into bargaining is just going to be good in general. It's that building the rank and file organization. So connecting up with, going department to department and other people that outside of the department, and linking that all together as much as you can, I really think is really how you kind of lay the foundation for, a group of people who either hold, leadership accountable, or, organizes a vote no, or even votes, forms a slate in the next election, whatever the particular form, that it takes, yeah.
Last thing I just want to quickly say is, like, very often when we were looking to find more comrades, we would call open meetings, actually just like open formations with undergrads, with other workers, a call that really resonated, whether it was conversations around policing or things we thought might really kind of connect us. And in that space, like, agree to form some kind of a coalition that would often actually push the union. So it's a style that I've seen happen on many campuses, a way of building kind of a seed. And then each of those people has their own connections and networks and places. So it may be a kind of way to begin mobilizing if you're looking to build just a core of comrades who can carry a project to the next place.
Okay. Well, any other questions or comments from folks? If not, we'll be back in a month again, back in a similar space with Sheila leading the conversation. And so maybe it's time for us to use that Q&A as a follow-up to this conversation as well. A month is a long time, enough time for things to kind of bubble up. So
I think
thank you
Katie
all so
had
much. What I'll
was
do
gonna
is I'll
say.
post. Okay, sorry, I missed that. Katie, you have a hand up?
I had I thought I typed it and then I realized my phone wasn't working. Sorry. So I was gonna reply along the same veins of kind of like where to go, and also I think related to building solidarity outside the university is also kind of like trying to counter some of the rhetoric that comes from within UAW 2865 that really like reinforces or builds upon the UC being like a prestigious public university, and more clearly demonstrating or showing how the UC is tied up with a lot of different imperial projects, and sort of serves in many ways to keep reproducing the ruling class. Which I think if like following that kind of ideology is also a good way to find people who are interested in organizing, because there are probably folks who are thinking or wondering about that, but don't really see an opportunity to talk about it within the union that much.
Yeah, I'll add real quick. I had mentioned briefly in my talk that we in 2014 voted to join the BDS movement, which was later overturned by the International in 2015. But there's a tendency or multiple tendencies on the left that's like, well, the best way to go about organizing folks is class only stuff, the bread and butter stuff. And I think most, if not all, but probably most, I mean, I can't really speak to who was involved in the rank and file at other campuses so much, but the AWDU folks that I've known throughout the years, let me put it like that, from my perspective, right, we centered anti-oppression work as well as part of class organizing. And so, joining having this vote to join the BDS movement, some people would be like, oh, well, you're making the union more political. What about the people that maybe don't agree with that? If we're trying to build a strong majority, and this is, I think, again, part of the one of the issues, one of the ways in which, and this might be something that Sheila ends up talking about, one of the ways in which whiteness and sort of imperial and other colonial mindsets sort of can take hold is if you're only thinking about appealing to that lowest common denominator as a majority, instead of saying we're going to be a radicalizing, educating force that tries to build a majority. And so, they would say, well, something like that's going to hurt the union. You should stay out of that. But we actually had more people join and more people vote in the BDS vote than voted on the previous contract, the contract ratification that had just happened right before that. And so, I think when unions take clear stands and say, this is our vision of the world, and we want this, a better kind of world, and this is how we in our particular social location are going to try to leverage the various powers, privileges, positions that we have to try to make it better. I think it's something that can draw people in. And it's an N of one. I don't know what other studies are out there that look at that. But just from my own life experience, it definitely felt as if it, didn't just feel, but it definitely was that, the whole, union getting involved in Palestine solidarity work was something that made the union stronger. And so, yeah, I think that, yeah, that's all I want to say.
Yeah, this has been great. Thanks for the conversation, y'all. And like I said, we'll be back in about a month. We'll announce a date shortly on Strike Q, and the recording will go up on our archive page, and I'll upload all the slideshow to the Strike. See you next time. Thanks.
I just want to say thanks again, Anush, for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And it was nice getting to chat with you.
Yeah, no, it was great. And hopefully we'll run into one another in person sometime in Davis or Sacramento. Maybe a gathering with Tori or something sometime, especially
Yeah, hopefully.
now that, you know, next month, I'm sure things are going to be happening on campus for the pepper spray stuff too. And so we'll connect and hopefully run some of the events around that in person.
Yeah, sounds great. All right, take it easy.
Take it easy. Thanks, Duane.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.